You're speaking with Christina Burke, and this will be the last of these interviews before the holidays. We're taking a little break from that. And since I started this back in March, you're the first person I've spoken with that I actually got to meet in person um, before interviewing you over Zoom. So that's really cool because what we're talking about today is something that people have to go out in the world to witness and see as things reopen and we shift back to that life.
Yeah.
So yesterday you told me about how this exhibit came together and the co-curators involved in this. And we're talking about Hearts of Our People at Philbrook. So could you recap that for me?
Sure. Well, this project has been collaborative from the very beginning. So there are two co-curators, Jill Alberg-Yo, who's at the Minneapolis Institute of Art, and Terry Greaves, who is a Kiowa artist and community scholar, independent curator. And so they had this idea for an exhibition about a traveling exhibition specifically about Native women's art, but quickly realized that it was too big and ambitious a project for just the two of them. So they called together an advisory board of 21 women, artists, curators, scholars, etc., most of whom were Native. A couple of us are not Native, but we met for 2 days in Minneapolis in November of 2015 to start this process of creating a checklist, talking about art and artists and artistic traditions, and reaching out to communities and how the show would be organized and who would write for the catalog. That collaboration with the co-curators and the advisory board has continued through the installation of the show at Philbrook here in Tulsa within the boundaries of Muskogee Creek Nation.
So what role did you play in this from the beginning? You said this started in 2015. So you're one of the people on the 21 woman committee. And what kind of input did you have to give them? What was it like working with a representative from the Philbrook? And especially as a person, you just did a land acknowledgement, who knows that, you know, Philbrook has a large collection of Indigenous art. And in some ways, you're representing those communities locally.
Yes, well, that's a big question to answer. I'll start with the specific first, and in terms of my involvement with the project. So, actually, in September of 2014, co-curator Terry Greaves and her mother, the late Jerry Abihill, came through Tulsa, and I had the chance to visit with them and talk a bit about all kinds of things. And so there were some informal discussions between Terry and myself. And then I was honored to be invited as part of this advisory board. And so my involvement has taken on a couple of different roles. One, in terms of the advisory board and those conversations about the checklist, the organization of the show, which is thematic, unlike many shows of Native art, but also helping to host the curatorial team and some advisory board members when they came to Oklahoma to do research on collections, not just at Philbrook, but at Gilcrease, at the Cowboy Hall of Fame, at the Sam Noble and Fred Jones down at OU. I also wrote for the catalog, and from the very beginning, the co-curators and the advisory board thought it was important for the show to travel to Oklahoma, since this is the home of many Native nations since time immemorial, but also tribes who've been forcibly removed here, and individuals who have moved here for all kinds of reasons, for school, for jobs, for relationships. And so they thought it was important that the show be in Oklahoma. And I was thrilled that the Philbrook leadership agreed that the show should come to our institution.
So you were going to be on that advisory board nevertheless, but it was your relationship with Philbrook that made it the final of 4 stops on the touring exhibit, right?
Yes, and again, from the beginning, the co-curators and advisory board reached out to a number of different museums, and these kinds of large traveling shows, it's very complex and complicated trying to figure out does it fit into, you know, the exhibition schedules of different institutions, um, you know, the schedule, the budget, what about audiences and how it might be received in that particular community. It's complicated to organize
Right.
one of these shows to travel the country.
And can you talk about those three thematic categories that the advisory board agreed upon to organize the exhibit, and also a little bit about the wall tags? And there's little interesting quirks that make this show different, maybe from other art shows people have seen.
Sure. So one of the things that the co-curators and the advisory board thought was important from the beginning is that this exhibition, this project, present the work of Indigenous women in new ways. A lot of shows of Native art are organized either chronologically, so from ancient art to contemporary art, sort of a timeline, or geographically with a big map showing culture areas and presenting work from the plains or Oklahoma or the Southwest. Nobody wanted to do that. So then the question was, how will the artwork be organized and presented? And through a lot of discussion, what was decided on were these three themes of legacy, relationships, and power. And by having these very broad themes, the curators and the advisory board could present these individual objects no matter what time, place, or artistic tradition they represented, but group them together in a way that stories and narratives could be presented in new and different ways than the timeline or the geographic um, approach.
Okay. And um, something that I found really impactful about the show is just the range of what is presented and represented. That, you know, you have indigenous clothing and beadwork, you have paintings, you have photography, you have pottery, baskets. You know, it's such a it's such an interesting thing that maybe even in traditional museums, these items are grouped in different rooms or different wings or different sections, but it's interesting seeing them organized that way and all brought together.
Yeah, and that was another thing that the co-curators and advisory board were adamant about, that the work should not be presented by type. So not all the basketry together, not all the pottery together. Um, and yeah, but it is definitely a wide range of kinds of work: sculpture,
Right.
installation. There's even a car as part of the exhibition, Rose Simpson's Maria, um, as well as poetry and literary arts. And a clip
Yeah.
of Maria Falchief dancing in the ballet The Firebird, which was written for her.
Can you talk briefly about the car and the relationship of the car specifically to the work of Maria Martinez and the pottery that are in the collections, the permanent collections that
Sure. So the car was created inside and out by artist Rose B. Simpson, who's from Santa Clara Pueblo in New Mexico. She is a multimedia artist, comes from a long line of ceramic artists. And she's also a gearhead. She loves cars and working on them. So she found this 1985 Chevy El Camino for sale on the side of the road, and bought it and fixed it up. And for a while, she and her family used it to harvest food from their farm. And she says that one day, you know, they were putting the harvest in the back of that El Camino, and she was thinking about how practical it was because the bed of the El Camino is so low, so it was very easy to put the food in there. And then she thought, well, this is like our traditional Pueblo pottery that we use for everyday food gathering and preparing and serving meals. And so she got this idea to transform that utilitarian object, a vessel, into a work of art honoring Pueblo potter Maria Martinez, who was from San Ildefonso Pueblo, just near Santa Clara. And Maria Martinez was well known for creating this unique surface design on her pottery of black on black pottery. So the surface is both shiny and matte. It's all black, but the texture of the surface, there's this contrast between the shiny, which has been polished or burnished, and the matte finish, which has been overpainted with slip or a watery form of clay. And that type of pottery that Maria and her husband Julian created back in, well, 100 years ago in the early 20th
Right.
century became really popular among non-native collectors. And they demonstrated how to create this work at world's fairs in St. Louis, in San Diego, in
Wow.
Chicago. So lots of people saw it, collected it. You find it in Museum of Modern Art, as well as the Art Institute of Chicago and the Smithsonian. So that black on black pottery became really famous and important. So Rose painted that Chevy El Camino black on black paint. So customizing that surface in honor of Maria Martinez and the work that she had done, and sort of the place that Maria holds in terms of being recognized as an individual Indigenous woman who created this kind of work that is known worldwide.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe I read that Maria and her husband resurrected an old tradition, that it's not that they invented the black on black or these processes, they just developed them and continued them. And that sort of continuation is important because a lot of native artwork and traditions are based in old practices that are threatened to go away. And I see Rose as being an
Mm,
artist that has carried that on to a new generation in a different way and commented upon it.
definitely. So yes, that black on black pottery had been made by Pueblo ancestors, but the knowledge of how to create it had been broken. So
Right.
the artistic line, there was a break in it. So Maria and Julian rediscovered how to make that pottery that their ancestors had made. So they revived it. Um, and yeah, Rose is definitely honoring that tradition, but taking it to a whole other level by putting that kind of surface on different material, a different kind of object. And it was not easy, but we are thrilled that we were able to bring the car to Philbrook, and it's installed in our gardens. So it's not, it is part of the exhibition, but it's not in the gallery, it's outside in the gardens.
It's a nice walk down there. And then I really appreciated something that is not officially within the exhibit, but you've, on the second floor of the rotunda, there are lots of Maria Martinez's pots, and I especially like the photographs and the wall text up there. That was very cool.
And that's something, Philbrook has a large and important collection of Pueblo pottery, most of which is documented. We know the names of most of those makers. And we have work by Maria Martinez and actually 4 generations of her family in our collection. And it's a show that we were thinking about doing, but honestly, during the shutdown because of COVID, and thinking about bringing Hearts of Our People to Tulsa, but also giving everybody a chance to experience this artwork in safe ways. And so having different kinds of artwork throughout the museum, galleries, and gardens, we decided to bring out almost all of our Maria pottery and put it throughout 2 galleries, as you said, on the upper floor of Philbrook. So those are part of our permanent collection. In addition to these photographs by another woman artist, not native, but Laura Gilpin, who was a photographer in the Southwest and was a longtime friend of Maria and her family. So they knew each other over about 3 decades. And during that time, Laura Gilpin took all kinds of photographs of Maria creating pottery, gathering clay, processing clay, firing these objects,
Making bread
making bread,
in the pottery ovens. Yeah.
which is not, yeah, not unlike how pottery is made and fired, but
Yeah.
the firing's a little different. Those hornos, those bread ovens, are a little bit different than the ways that Pueblo people fire their pottery in pits in the ground. But you get a sense of that process and that work, and it also allows, again, Philbrook to offer several different areas of inside and outside for visitors to experience art by Indigenous women. But
Right.
it's one of the ways that we can help keep everybody safe during this challenging time.
Yeah, for anyone concerned still about going in public, Philbrook was definitely the safest place I've been. Feels safer than the grocery store or any other place that's taking precautions. But I felt that you guys are really handling things well with the precautions that are in place.
Well, thank
Yeah,
you.
yeah,
We reopened to the public just this month.
right.
Um, and you know, we weren't sure how visitors, how the community would react, but we require masks, social distancing, and advanced tickets. So we're limiting the number of people at any given time. And then again, by offering exhibitions of Indigenous women's art in various areas of the gardens and grounds, as well as some reinstalled galleries in other parts of the museum too. There's, even if you've been to Philbrook before, there's lots of new stuff to see
There
and
is.
experience.
I was surprised by that. I think it had been at least a year since the last time I did a thorough visit, passing through all the galleries, and a lot has changed. And I was also surprised with the um, with the shutting down of Philbrook downtown and how you guys have moved the collections around. I imagine if somebody did a survey and looked at the percentage of Indigenous art overall on the walls, it would be very high, you know, compared to the work by European artists or American artists of non-Indigenous descent. There's lots of Native art on display right now.
On every level of the museum,
Yeah, yeah,
and in the gardens.
yeah,
Um, yeah, so Philbrook downtown closed at the end of last year, so actually before COVID. Um, and we moved the collection back to our main campus. One of the challenges that every museum has is that they can only exhibit or display a small percentage of their collection at any given time. And part of that is by design. We want to care for the collections. And so certain kinds of artwork, like watercolors, prints, photographs, works on paper, should only be displayed and exposed to the light for very
mhm,
short periods of time. Basketry and other objects made of organic materials, it's the same thing. So we want to be able to rotate and have new things out on exhibit, not just for the visitor's experience, which of course is important, but also thinking about conservation and preservation of the objects themselves. So we will continue to rotate both native and non-native art in our galleries moving forward.
and back to the exhibit, I was also struck by the local presence in um, Umli exhibit. You know, you've got baskets by Shen Gosshorn, who passed away several years ago. You have work by Anita Fields, a contemporary Osage artist who's also a Tulsa Artist Fellow. You have the video of Maria Tallchief, who was born 10 minutes in Fairfax from where I'm sitting now, and
Yes.
actually a distant relation of mine. But
Ah,
you know, it's cool to go to an exhibit and see work by living and past artists and artisans from this area. So
well, and
yeah,
that's great to hear from a native perspective here in Oklahoma. And all three of those artists you mentioned, Shan, Anita, and Maria Tallchief, all of those artists were in every single venue for this show. So in Minneapolis at the Minneapolis Institute of Art, at the Frist Museum in Nashville, Tennessee, and at the Renwick Gallery in Washington, D.C., as well as here at Philbrook. So those three artists you mentioned, um, who are from Oklahoma, have Oklahoma connections anyway, were chosen by the co-curators and the advisory board from the very beginning, back in
right.
2015. So for those three, it's not just that it's here in Oklahoma, it's
No,
that
yeah,
they're recognized nationally and internationally as important artists.
yeah. It just goes to show that this show goes beyond, or it just has strong local ties. You know, I mean, there's also lots of work by First Nations artists up in Canada. There's just such a broad range of art, but I found those local connections very cool because I appreciate their work, especially. And can you talk about the Joy Harjo event that you guys had last week?
Well, yes, I was thrilled to be able to host Joy Harjo in the Philbrook Gardens last week. Well, and one of the other things that there are 8 poems and literary texts that have been part of this exhibition from the very beginning. So again, thinking about the breadth of arts that are part of Hearts of Our People. So there's a selection of a poem by Joy Harjo called Remember. That's part of this exhibition, has traveled to Minneapolis, Nashville, DC, and is here. Um, and so early on, because Joy is here in Tulsa and part of the Tulsa Artist Fellowship, we thought it'd be a great idea to have her perform while the show was on exhibit at Philbrook. But of course, given the realities of what's been happening over the last several months, it's been a challenge, both scheduling, but also making sure that we could invite Joy and have visitors come and have a safe and enjoyable experience. So we actually had set up a little stage out at the gardens and had her perform last Friday, so October 13th, and had almost 200 people sitting outside in the gardens and socially distanced and everyone wearing masks, and a great time was had by all. It got a little chilly at the end, which Joy will tell you as well. But to be able to have that kind of event in person, but do it in a safe way. And again, we're really lucky at Philbrook to have 25 acres of gardens and grounds. And we were in an area right near Rose Simpson's car and near the poetry walk that we've installed. And so it was definitely, a part of the installation that's inside, but in a context outside where everyone could feel safe and still enjoy hearing the U.S. Poet Laureate read some of her poems and other people's poems as well. She actually read a section of poems by Stacy Pratt, as well as a selection by Rose Simpson. So Joy highlighted other Indigenous women authors and poets, as well as her own work.
And beyond visual art, literary text, material culture, the exhibit, or at least the Philbrook's relationship to this exhibit, exists on even other levels. You mentioned yesterday that there was a tribe who donated their heirloom heritage seeds that will be grown in the Philbrook gardens, and that the Philbrook Gardens have donated over a ton of food to, which organization was it?
Food Bank of Eastern Oklahoma and
Yeah.
Food on the Move.
So, I mean, that really goes above and beyond for an exhibit, not only to highlight Indigenous female artists, but to be also invested in food sovereignty and charity in such a way that is an important aspect of Native life.
Well, and again, Philbrook has 25 acres of gardens and grounds, and for several years we've had this vegetable garden and have donated to local food banks and organizations and partnered with them. With Hearts of Our People, we thought, well, what are some other ways we can partner with other community groups? So the Intertribal Agricultural Council and Pawnee Nation Seed Preservation Program very generously donated heirloom seeds. So we've been working with them and our horticulture staff to add those heirloom seeds to our Victory Garden. And coming up in November, we are organizing we're calling a Harvest Weekend. So November 13th and 14th. Programming around the gardens and these collaborations. So there will be programs led by the group Matriarch, talking about food sovereignty. And we're working with some Native chefs, Nico Albert among them, thinking about food demonstrations and recipes, sharing stories about food and celebrations. And so there are lots of ways that we can and are and should continue to collaborate, not just with visual artists, as you mentioned, or performers, but with Indigenous communities, with seed keeping, and we're open to other kinds of collaborations as well. So it's really exciting right now, particularly as we're all challenged
Right.
by the reality of this virus. So
Yeah.
we're open to those new ways to collaborate to help our community writ large.
Yeah, like you can't have a traditional uh, gallery opening in a sense indoors with everyone gathered there. So you have the joy event, and then this this harvest season, I actually have personally already uploaded those events to the Root website. So we're happy to
Thank you.
come full circle and direct people back to the Philbrook to check out those events. And my last question is a more theoretical one. I've been thinking about this since we spoke yesterday, and specifically with indigenous artifacts, there's a very fine line between something that was just created by an unknown anonymous artisan and something that is considered art, you know, because there's museums of anthropology, ethnography that have large collections, whether it's an arrowhead or a skirt or a dress or other tribal objects. And have you guys had those sorts of discussions, or what's your thoughts on that line between something that is a cultural artifact that is made by sort of a person who isn't remembered as an artist and something that is created by, you know, someone who is recognized as an artist or artisan?
We have those discussions all the time.
Um,
And
to interrupt real quick, a great
yeah,
example of this is with the piece by Anita. There are two children's dresses, traditional Osage dress, that are just written as being by Osage artists. Or my traditional dance clothes are made by somebody, but uh, Anita has thankfully achieved that status where what she creates is showcased in museums, but those pieces from her family's collection and her family history are not seen in the same light.
but by many people,
Yeah.
but they are by some people, and it is an important discussion that continues. Um, um, so full disclosure, I'm actually an anthropologist by training, and have worked in various kinds of museums, from the Smithsonian Museum of Natural History, and for a short time, the Museum of the American Indian. I also worked at the Heritage Center at Red Cloud Indian School on the Pine Ridge Reservation in South
Mm.
Dakota, and now at Philbrook, which is an art museum. And each one of those institutions has a little bit different, has large native collections, but a different perspective on those objects and how to present them. From my perspective, they're all art. I don't, um, there is a distinction between objects that were made for use within a native community and within that context versus art that was made for non-native collectors or curators. But even those cultural arts that were made for use within a community, whether clothing for ceremony, utilitarian objects for food preservation and serving, there's still aesthetics. There's cultural meaning, symbolism, significance that went into creating them. There's often mentorship and teaching and passing on of lessons of how to create these objects, when to harvest, uh, uh, whether it's plant material for a basket, for instance, how to harvest so that it's sustainable, how to process those materials. That's the kind of knowledge that is often passed down in families or within communities. Maybe people aren't going to school, to a university, to an art school to learn it, but it's still knowledge and education nonetheless. So I see, regardless of the time period when objects were made, um, there's still art and aesthetics behind it.
Yeah. And it's, I guess it's up to the institutions on how they categorize that in the end, you know, or up to the researcher, the scholar, or even just the citizen to research, you know, who made this, where did it come from? Because a lot of that gets lost by time or,
And
yeah.
for a lot of the older objects, the people who were collecting them, often non-native people, didn't bother to write down or record or document the name of those artists. And
Mhm.
often those objects, those cultural arts, were made by women: pottery, basketry, beadwork, clothing, etc. Um, but particularly with this show, one of the things that was a focus for the co-curators and the advisory board was to find as many historical works by named artists. So the Beaded Valise by Nellie Tuber Gates from the
Hmm.
Standing Rock community, the Pomo Feathered Basket by Susie Santiago Billy. There are those examples out there. Sometimes it takes a little research
Right.
and talking with family and community members, because that information might not be in museum records, but the family knows and the community knows. So we should be talking to family and community members.
A practical example of that is in the Philbrook gift shop. There's jewelry created by local native artists for sale, featured because of this exhibit. Or if somebody was able to travel, you go to the plaza at Santa Fe on the weekends, and the native artisans are out there selling their pots, selling their jewelry, and those connections are really interesting.
And they're really important now. Again, during COVID, a lot of those markets and shows have been shut down. So for the
Yeah,
first time ever, Santa Fe Indian Market didn't happen.
yeah.
Cherokee Art Market is going virtual this year. It didn't happen this month,
Hmm.
but there'll be a virtual Cherokee Art Market in December. Um, so having outlets for artists to sell their work is important as well. So we have jewelry, we have books, CDs and recordings by local Native women in our shop as well.
And to wrap it up, what is some advice, or what can people do, beyond coming to the Philbrook and seeing this great show or purchasing the exhibit catalog? Can you offer any advice on people who want to learn more or educate themselves about Native art and artists? Maybe some
Well,
resources.
yeah, absolutely. Actually, the Minneapolis Institute of Art that organized this show from the beginning has an incredible website with all kinds of resources, including some curriculum materials, K through 12 curriculum materials that were created by Native educators in Minnesota in conjunction with the museum. And although it's related to Hearts of Our People, it's not limited to Hearts of Our People. So there's some really good resources in general in terms of Native history, culture, arts, languages. Um, and there's also a lot of virtual material out there. So one of the things about the three themes that we talked about, legacy, relationships, and power, there are videos that Minneapolis created in association with those themes. Those are available online. There's an audio guide with additional Native voices talking about specific objects in the show. There are also some great publications, periodicals like First American Art magazine,
Right.
published by America Meredith, who's Cherokee Nation and here in Oklahoma. But it covers Indigenous art throughout the hemisphere, historical and contemporary, South American, Central American, North American. So there's lots of great resources out there. Some are online. Um, Lots you can order from online. You don't have to go to a museum shop or bookstore, but there are some great resources out there by Native authors, by Native curators, by Native artists and performers. It's not hard to find. They're available.
Yeah. Well, I'm happy I asked about that, and I hope that people are able to both see the show and check out those resources. So thank you so much for talking to me. I really enjoyed seeing the show yesterday and our talk today.
I appreciate your time. Thanks, Mason.
Yeah, I hope to be able to see you again or see some of your wonderful shows in the future.
I'll keep you in the loop.
All right. Talk to you later.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.